Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this webinar, 10 Steps Towards Successful Digital Transformation by Adopting, Adapting and Applying VeriSM. Thank you very much for joining us today. We're very pleased to be able to deliver this webinar. I just want to give you a bit of an idea first of what you can expect today. First of all, we will say who we are as presenters. We will introduce ourselves. I'm also very pleased today to be able to say that we're joined by several VeriSM contributors and even lead authors. I know Suzanne van Hove is in the call, Claire Agata is in the call, and perhaps some of the other contributors are joining at some point as well, Simona Jo Moore. So it's very pleased to have that support today. I'm going to start with a very brief introduction about the challenge of digital transformation. And also, I know that we have some VeriSM contributors and ambassadors today, but I also think there's probably some people that are less familiar with the approach. So I'll give a very brief overview of what VeriSM is, but don't worry, this will be a very brief introduction because I know some of you are quite familiar with it, and we'll soon get to the meat of the webinar, which is really the VeriSM 10 steps, and we'll take you through those step by step, and of course providing practical examples of how that can be applied. So we'll also be providing, as part of that, I'll also be pleased to bring in one of the early adopters, Cloud Gateway. Steve Leach from Cloud Gateway is also joined, so I'll also be bringing him in at some point to provide some examples of how Cloud Gateway have applied VeriSM. And of course, at the end, we'll have some room for questions and answers. You can ask questions via the questions function in GoToWebinar, and we'll have some time to answer those at the end. I'm also pleased that this webinar is a collaboration. It's delivered by Embed in collaboration with partners in the International Foundation for Digital Competencies, the IFDC, the initiator, if you like, of VeriSM, and also with APMG International and BCS. So it's very much a collaborative effort, I'm pleased to say. So just a brief introduction about myself. I have worked in the IT certification industry for many years, and then the last years in, well, actually it's the other way around. I've worked in IT education now for many years, having started in the IT services industry. I'm portfolio director within Exim, so I'm responsible for Exim's broad certification portfolio. And perhaps most importantly for this webinar, I'm a VeriSM contributor and the VeriSM chief examiner for the IFDC. So, David, could I ask you to briefly introduce yourself, please?
Sure thing, and hello everybody. My name's David Barrow, and I'd like to echo Suzanne by thanking you all very much for joining us today. I'm hoping it'll be a really useful webinar for all of us. I've worked in a variety of service management and customer focused IT roles for over 20 years now. I've led and worked within some amazing teams and also seen so many changes to the ways we work and engage with customers and consumers over that time period. I first became aware of VeriSM in 2018 and became a VeriSM professional in the summer of 2019. And since my first engagement with VeriSM, I've become somewhat of an advocate. So it's my pleasure to be here with you today.
Excellent. Thanks very much, David. So just very briefly on digital transformation and the challenge, if you like, of digital transformation. I think most organizations recognize the opportunities offered these days by digital transformation. However, research indicates that 70% of digital transformation initiatives will not reach their stated goals, and that equates to around $900 billion of waste. And that's been reported by different sources: Forbes, the Harvard Business Review, McKinsey. I think it actually originates from some research from McKinsey. And the reasons that are mentioned primarily for this failure, one is the lack of the right mindset needed to bring about change. If change is mainly seen as a technology thing, then of course it's not going to work. It's really about the cultural and mindset change. A second is lack of clear strategy and goals. Obviously, it's difficult to reach your stated goals if you haven't clearly defined what they are beforehand. The capability gap, and what often happens is that organizations start off getting help from outside, consultants, they hire in expertise, and as they scale up and move beyond pilot phase, they find that their internal capabilities are lacking, and that also leads to a capability gap, which also contributes to the failure. And of course, silo thinking. If digital transformation is sort of approached as an IT project, I think most of us realise that ain't going to work. So that's just very briefly on the challenge of digital transformation. And actually, I really like this quote from Joe Peppard, one of the principal research scientists at the MIT Sloan Centre for Information Systems Research. And you know, he basically says that IT as a wholly separate functional unit should cease to exist. So instead of trying to redesign the IT unit in a kind of digital savvy way, we should be much more looking at how to organise in a completely different way to be able to be successful with technology, and that's not necessarily with a separate IT unit. So I think that's quite interesting. So again, I'm only going to do the VeriSM introduction very briefly because I'm aware that some of you already know it. We all love our names in this industry. VeriSM, it stands for value-driven, evolving, responsive, and integrated. And I think as I explain in the next couple of slides, it'll be clear those things will come to the fore. We already mentioned about silo thinking, and this is one of the key things about VeriSM. It's an enterprise service management approach. So basically, the view of VeriSM is that an organization has to use all of its capabilities, and I deliberately use the word capability and not department or unit, to deliver value to the consumer through products and services. So it kind of does away with the whole business and IT discussion, which has been going on for donkey's years. The way VeriSM sees it, IT is the business. It's a key capability of the business, and it needs to work with all the other areas like HR, sales, legal, finance, marketing, etc., to deliver value through products and services. So it's no longer IT serving the business. IT is an integral part of the business, and the approach has to be throughout the business as an enterprise service management approach. The VeriSM model itself is quite simple. There's an outer governance ring to make sure that there's alignment with strategy and enough control, the right amount of control, not too much, not too little. The service management principles act as kind of guardrails, are relevant for all products and services. Whatever you're doing with products and services, you have to define them, produce them, provide them, and respond. How you do that, iteratively or more waterfall, that can differ per organization. And the consumer runs all the way through the model because, it's a consumer definition of value, which is used for the value-driven part to make sure that that's driven by the consumer. And there's the concept of the management mesh, which some of you may be familiar with. It's not rocket science, but it's a very powerful tool that can be used. It basically looks at 4 different aspects: resources, including knowledge, people, time, environment, and that includes aspects like organizational culture and legislation, management practices, and again, these don't have to be IT focused, they can be across the organization, and emerging technologies, AI, blockchain, cloud, all kind of different technologies that organizations can use to support their strategies and their business aims. So basically, the VeriSM management mesh looks at these 4 aspects. It looks at baseline situation and a desired state situation. It's unique to every organization, and it can be flexed based on new and changed requirements as they come up. So it kind of does away with the one size fits all and takes a more customized view of your organization, since every organization is unique and will have unique needs. So that's all I'm going to say about VeriSM, because again, it's not the meat of the webinar today. We want to get into the 10 steps, but it's basically an approach which helps organizations to develop the agile culture that's needed for digital transformation. And particularly with the management mesh, it helps you to integrate methodologies and technologies that support the digital strategy and to govern them under one model. And that's why we can kind of see it as a kind of umbrella approach. Okay, we're about to move on to the 10 steps, and at this stage I'd just like to invite Claire to say something. Claire, I'm going to have to unmute you, so bear with me. I'd like to ask you if you could briefly say something about why the 10 steps is the next logical step in the development of VeriSM.
Hi, Suzanne. Can you hear me okay?
Certainly. Welcome. Thanks, Claire.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm not going to take too much time because I'm really looking forward to hearing from David and Steve in the webinar, but I thought it might be helpful just to give a little bit of context to these 10 steps. So when we wrote the first VeriSM book, we wrote that based on the research that Exin had done and the IFDC had done into people's opinions on the service management guidance that was available at the time. And what we wanted to do was reimagine service management for the digital age. So the feedback we got on the first book was that people loved it, but then they said, you know, how do I do it? This sounds great. How do I do it? And in the second book, we wrote that very much from a practitioner's perspective. So we gave much more guidance and we walked through a case study and using the management mesh. But if you've seen that second VeriSM book, it's big. You know, there's a lot of information in there. So for me, the 10 steps is kind of the next logical output from VeriSM, because it really is saying to people, you know, your management mesh is going to be unique to your organization. What digital transformation looks like for you might be different to what it looks like from your competitors, but these are the rough steps that you need to follow, and it's going to help people to just give a little bit of structure, you know, envision this as a journey that they're going to go on. So I think the 10 steps are incredibly useful, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about how people use them. And I think
Sorry, Claire, we just lost the last part there.
that's quite all right. I think that's all from me.
Okay, thanks very much, Claire. I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
So moving on then to the next slide, bear with me. Yeah, just before we go, there's a couple of important things. One is, it's always, of course, important to ask the why question and the what question, I suppose, as well. So why are you doing this? What are you trying to achieve with your digital transformation? What are you expecting to get out of using the VeriSM approach? So I think it's important to understand the purpose of these 10 steps as well. As Claire said, you know, they're not going to give you all the answers, but they can be a very useful roadmap and guidance in helping you through the doing the right things. In terms of timeline and order, obviously every organisation is at a different stage. It can be that your organisation is already doing a lot of the things in these 10 steps, and please don't see it as a parallel thing that you have to do in order. You know, you could be doing quite a lot of the steps in parallel, and it could be that you've already established some of the things in some of the steps. So please see it as a roadmap, as a guidance tool that can help you in that journey, but always stop to consider what you want to achieve, why you're doing it, and where you are now. So without any further ado, because the meat of the webinar today is about the 10 steps. So introducing the first step then, and that's establish digital leadership. Successful digital transformation requires digital leaders with specific skills to ensure that the right circumstances are created for digital transformation to flourish. Obviously, these are different skills than perhaps were needed some years ago. So I'd like to ask you, David, at this point, how important is it to get a commitment from management level? And can you perhaps provide an example of that from your experience?
Thanks, Suzanne. Yeah, sure. I mean, the short answer to the question is that it's vitally important to get and maintain that management commitment. In my experience, when working with one client, we had a really clear focus on the service quality of both customer-facing digital services and older existing services. And we were charged with looking at a customer's journey end to end. So this is in a business that has a global reach, It's a respected brand and it has services that are dependent upon one another. And we found that a number of those services were tied together almost like spaghetti with dependencies all over the place. What we found as we were digging is that we were essentially attempting to undo many years of unintentional inequality in service definition and design. So in terms of our digital leadership, we were lucky that we had some senior sponsors who understood that we were looking at those customer journeys, and we enabled the program and established digital leadership through a focus on stakeholder management. We sought to establish who the go-to people were and their place within the organization. And we achieved this through not only focusing on their day-to-day role, but also their influence, their input, on their impact on service definition, production, and support. And key to that was also their formal and informal interactions with service consumers. We used this stakeholder map to initially establish the network that we'd focus upon, and ultimately we built a sustainable group that can influence others. This group was made up of stakeholders at C-level, but all within the operational and consumer-facing teams, and ultimately we identified VeriSM champions at each of those levels. A real key benefit as we were establishing leadership and also getting the message out there was that we were keen to stress that we were focusing on enhancing what was already there. So we weren't asking people to decouple or de-invest in their training or their management practices or even their technology or suppliers. What we were looking to do was to enhance that using that VeriSM thinking.
Thanks very much for that, David. The VeriSM champions, what kinds of position did they have within the organisation? That's interesting to know, I think.
Yeah, sure. So some of those were at C-level, and they helped us influence from top down. But the majority actually came from teams who were struggling to either manage interdependent services or services that were recipients of service from other services within the organisation. And these were people that had exhausted a number of options in improving their service. And because we focused on people and practices rather than technology, they came on board to try and find a new way to get things done.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, so basically you've got the digital leaders and the support from C-level, but also VeriSM champions at in different roles within the organisation. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think a number of people were probably really keen and ultimately towards the end tired of hearing us say managing up, because we wanted to make sure that we were giving people the ability to share the message up as well as push the message down. And ultimately we flattened how these services were run in terms of organisation structure to ultimately improve service for consumers.
Yeah. Thanks very much, David. Very interesting. And I think that was at a major bank, wasn't it?
It was a very well-known global establishment.
Yeah. Okay, excellent. So if I move on to step 2, establish enterprise governance. To effectively manage risk and assure alignment with business strategy, it's important to establish a structure for enterprise governance, including establishing the service management principles, which I talked about briefly when looking at the model. I'd like to start by giving a small example here from the European Central Bank, which the ECB is one of the early adopters of VeriSM, and they struggled with the fact that they were obviously a large bank in the finance sector, subject to a high level of compliance, and they found that sometimes was restricting their agility and ability to innovate. So they looked at a particular adaptation of the VeriSM model, and particularly the governance aspects of VeriSM, by developing this concept of minimal viable governance. And basically they established the service management principles, which were applied to all products and services regardless, but then they established a sort of minimal viable governance model, whereby in the case of high risk initiatives there was still an appropriately high level of governance, Obviously, the compliance is very important in that sector. But in the case of more low risk initiatives, instead of having a highly bureaucratic governance, which sort of led to very risk averse behaviour, with this minimal viable governance for those more low risk initiatives, they put in place a very minimal governance model, which allowed them to be a lot more agile and a lot more innovative. So I think that's an interesting example from a company that's in a very high compliance sector. And I think, David, if I understand correctly, you took a similar approach with one of your clients as well.
Yes, yeah, and I would say it was no coincidence that we did, if I'm perfectly honest. So as part of my getting to know VeriSM, I was interested to see what ECB were doing, and it was very, a really great approach that they took, and I won't lie, we sought to adapt and adopt some of that to our own needs. In our case, we actually looked to understand the existing governance models across the enterprise because it was so large. We worked with the stakeholders that I mentioned a moment ago to look at elements such as service reviews, service governance, and also to understand the compliance and the quality within those services, and also the potential for reputational or regulatory risk should service quality not be addressed. So what I mean by that is we were looking to understand what could go wrong with a service and how maybe we could intervene to stop that going wrong. So it's from here that we agreed something very similar to ECB's minimal viable governance, and we called it minimal viable risk. So not much of a departure, but we selected 5 proof of concept services. We chose to select a bite-sized piece of the global operation. 3 of those services were in the spotlight, so they were recognized as potentially troublesome or already troublesome, and 2 that seemingly operated well. And the point of choosing those 2 was to see if we would find similar things in those 2 services that are yet to be discovered. By taking these bite-sized pieces, we were also able to focus on governance without actually slowing day-to-day delivery or troubling any regulatory standard. The lessons we learned here formed the basis for our governance model, and we used that to evolve governance and the service management principles across the enterprise.
Yeah, thanks, David. So a similar kind of approach based on making sure that you're having enough control, but not too much control, basically.
Yes, yeah, and you'll hear me as we talk about these 10 steps. You'll hear me probably mention the proof of concept quite a lot, but that was key because there was no way we were ever going to be allowed to look at the enterprise as a whole and tinker. But by taking these 5 services and also saying that we would aim to put 3 of them right, that gave us the leverage to build from there and start to show results that meant that we could go through the other 7 steps that we have here in the model.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks very much, David. So if we go on to step 3, define the transformation approach. Obviously there are many different approaches and techniques which organizations can make use of to realize their unique transformation, and obviously the optimal approach needs to be very carefully considered. Again, here I'd like to pull on an example from the ECB because I found it really interesting how they approached their transformation journey. And basically they started by looking at how are we perceived now, and that's that led to a number of sort of different words that came up in their mind, and there on the left hand side, command and control, process, checklist, paper pushing. So that was how they felt that they were perceived at that moment. And on the right hand side, how did they want to be perceived? And then you've got more words around customer and service and expertise and consultancy and empowering and value. And then in the middle, if you like, is the iceberg where they looked at, okay, what do we need to do to get from that left hand side to that right hand side? And the deeper you get into the iceberg, of course, the more you get into behavioral and in some expertise, but it's more about the cultural mindset change. Things like conquer fear, open our minds, let go, those kinds of things. So I found this an interesting approach of how they basically defined where they were, how they were perceived right at that moment, how they wanted to be perceived and what was needed to get there. And they did that with people from different levels, different parts of the organisation involved to try and get that buy-in, so it became a collaborative transformation, if you like. So David, can you say something about the challenges of defining the right transformation approach, especially when you start talking about elements around behaviour and trust?
Yeah, sure. And just so everybody knows that we didn't just do everything the ECB did, we had a much bigger challenge here. In that some elements of this organisation had already started taking this journey. So we had to deal with an organisation that was in some cases on a digital journey through transformation, and in other cases almost ignoring that. And that's where behaviour and trust comes in. So again, going back to the proof of concepts, we selected services that were maybe seen to be further down this transformation journey than others, yet were seemingly still giving as much in terms of failure and risk as those that were not even on the journey yet. And what we found stood out as 3 areas to really start to work and understand behaviour and trust were skills, geography, and desire. They were real challenges in this global business. So once we understood our governance, we used the VeriSM champions to look at the risk to services versus the benefit of taking the time to implement service quality improvements. And the key word here is time. We were looking to encourage teams to step back from firefighting and actually look at their service holistically and understand where transformational opportunities existed. We did this across the proof of concept services, and we used this to share the tangible results that we were achieving over a month even. It was less than a month when we first started seeing results, and that generated further trust. We then demonstrated the value of our techniques through metrics, because everybody loves a good metric, and feedback, and built a scalable strategy that was actually supplier agnostic, and we lifted those lessons learned to the enterprise level. These results gained the trust and lifted the belief that a qualitative approach works. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to move into step 4, because these were running parallel, and talk to you more about culture, skills, and trust. So initially, what we've got here is the organising to embrace change and digitalization. Change is given in the digital context, which means the organisation structure and culture needs to be adapted in order to embrace that change, digitalization. And we struggled initially, I won't lie, to understand what our digital organisation looked like on a global scale. But again, through those proof of concepts and the stakeholders, we were able to start using our stakeholder map to understand what the digital organisation looked like, but also to start embedding governance and service management principles that worked for that organisation. It was at this point, when we had our stakeholders and our champions and people identified, that we conducted an online survey within our digital organisation. And we asked people some simple questions. How could they be better trained? How could they be more empowered? And how could they be better organised to elevate the quality of their services? This ultimately loaded the focus on people rather than technology. And we received an overall perspective from the responders that skills and thinking time could be enhanced. That enabled us to start influencing how the digital organisation evolved. Collecting this information anonymously also enabled us to deliver a culture of safety, which is vitally important if people want to be thinking innovatively. And as we started to adopt some of the feedback that we received, again, we were building on that trust. It also enabled us to measure global engagement via the tool that we used to run the surveys, and show that our professionals were engaged to the C-level, because we started to receive a larger response to our survey than previous employee engagement surveys had received, and that was a really powerful metric at the C-level. But going back to organization and step one, because as we've said previously, all of these steps kind of run at the same time and you're at varying levels. Key to this was that our sponsors and C-level were actually prepared to listen and also act upon that feedback. So this alone began to lift the quality of service as we started to see enhanced training, development, and also, where needed, investment and reorganization. And as we evolved, we were now beginning to add figures to our strategic plans that were demonstrating a service uplift on those proof of concept services and across all 5. But those 5 were now, because of the spaghetti scenario that I mentioned earlier, those 5 were now reaching into the organization, and they were influencing and subtly making changes, whether that be through behavior or whether that be through understanding of governance and service management. And we were able to start identifying issues before they occurred. And a simple example, but huge, was that we started to see gaps in commercials with suppliers that, had they not been closed, could have led to some real issues with that organization.
Thanks, David. I think there's a lot of really interesting things in there that that I'd like to pick on. I mean, you mentioned about building and establishing trust and reliance. You mentioned the importance of showing successes and doing that via relevant metrics for the different target groups, creating a culture of safety, and also the importance of digital leadership, if you like, the leaders being willing to act upon feedback. So not only to ask the organization what they think, but then also to actually do something with the feedback that they get back. So yeah, a lot of interesting points there, I think.
Yeah, thank you. And that one on acting is key. We could have lost momentum if the results of that survey had come back and not been addressed. It could have stopped us in our tracks, and thankfully that organisation and others that I've worked in were really keen to actually embrace that and make things happen. Yeah,
and I suppose it gives credibility to what you're trying to do. If you're talking about customer feedback being important and building that into the loop and doing something with it, then management needs to show that commitment as well by listening to their to the people that are doing the work and able to see it on the ground floor level as well.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. Excellent, thank you. So we move on to step 5, which is develop and embed collaborative and consumer-centric behaviours. Obviously, we've touched on this a little bit in some of the previous points, and obviously in the sort of introduction which I gave that talked about why digital transformations fail, and one of the reasons being the fact that they don't address the requirement for a shift in behaviour and mindset. So obviously, to be successful, digital transformation requires a shift in behaviour and mindset, and across the whole organisation as well, based on collaboration and customer centricity. So obviously, we've touched a little bit on this already, David, but can you give some examples of what's needed to really embed cultural change?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I go back to the previous step. So with the survey, we developed what we called a silent collaboration because it was anonymous. But because we then took that feedback and actually stimulated action, that survey also improved engagement, and the results also gave us some really good information. And we used the results of the survey to implement collaboration techniques and tools that the responders told us worked for them, both across their time zones and, probably more important, culturally. Some people are not comfortable with a face-to-face. They'd much prefer to do something in writing, for example, or one-to-one rather than part of a group. But we were now embedding collaboration through virtual and physical FaceTime, and we had regular focused service quality practices. And the point of these practices was to have a real focus on consumer-centric collaboration. And it ultimately resulted in our organizational movement to outcome-based shared goals and objectives that were common across all of the teams, from C-level to those actually delivering the services. And I should say that these goals were agreed across that audience. So they weren't handed down or handed up, it was actually agreed across the whole audience. And by measuring that quality from a customer perspective, we were also now defining what the new good looked like as a result of that feedback from end consumers to our teams. Another thing that we did to embed that collaboration was we repeated the survey. So 3 months later, we repeated the survey and mixed in a couple of new questions that started to measure the emotion that people had around their services and how they felt about it emotively now. And we supplemented that with the standard service level reporting, which was showing in most cases an upward trend. This gave us a temperature check of our direction, made sure that we were going in the right direction, and also allowed us to retain access to the teams and continually lift them from that day-to-day grind that I mentioned earlier of just keeping the lights on. We were keeping them customer-centric and thinking customer first. And as time went on, we had to do less of that, and that's frankly the program is no longer needed as a program because it's now a behavior that's embedded, and that was a real good success.
I think that probably sort of links in very well to step 6 as well, David, about organising to learn, unlearn and relearn. Obviously, a key success factor in the digital context is that ability to fail fast and learn quickly. You hear that a lot in the context of agile, fail fast, to do that again and again, but to also ensure that the learning can be shared with others. And I can imagine that's particularly challenging in a global environment where communication and knowledge sharing is more complex. Could you provide some examples of how that can be tackled?
Yeah, sure. So, I can give you an example of the fact that we had teams in Mexico and teams in the Far East, and you with the best will in the world, you're never going to get those people to be on the same call more than maybe once a month at a push. And we didn't have once a month. We need people to be thinking along these lines on a daily basis. So again, with results of the survey and the practices, we actually opened up communication platforms. Once, just to sort of reiterate the steps, once we understood our governance and our stakeholders, and we applied focus in the form of a series of joined up service practices with that outcome based and value stream focus agenda that I mentioned earlier. But we did simple things. So we'd have a chat group that was available 24/7 via instant messaging. But we also invited people to write about their experiences via blogs and others to comment on that openly, either in writing or via the practices. And what we ended up having now was an open and an actual global collaboration of knowledge. And this ended up building a knowledge base, which became a useful referral for all of the parties when managing existing services, but also for those who are seeking to define new services and looking to measure compliance. And we had a bit of a light bulb moment when we noticed that we were now actually implementing quality and value in the define stage, rather than firefighting when services were handed over to delivery teams, because now services were landing with little to no fanfare. There was no warranty period of crazy, we've got 1,000 incidents over 30 days, we can't possibly take that. That seemed to be reducing. And what we were now stepping towards was road mapping our services with a nod towards the define, produce, provide and respond phases, as highlighted in VeriSM. Another key point that I think was another true success was we invited process owners as guests to those service practices, those quality practices, who began by listening and then started contributing because they saw that we were holding discussions that were focused on output related to quality. But then these people started inviting us as a group to look at their processes and see if we could make any changes to their processes that would ultimately work better for the organization. And I'm glad Claire mentioned change management earlier, actually, because this for us was a key win, because now change management, who had been, there'd been some loggerheads in terms of enabling change, as there rightly should be in a high regulated environment. We were now able to work on elements of the services where we called it fail fast with trust, or fail fast and learn quickly, as we have here on the slide. And that was really good, because now people could actually make things happen that were consumer demands without having to go through as much red tape, because we understood the governance principle that we could apply to that element of a service.
Yeah, thanks, David. I think this is really interesting, and I'd also like to bring in Steve Leach at this stage. Steve is from one of the VeriSM early adopters, Cloud Gateway. Steve, is there anything you'd like to add to this from your experience at Cloud Gateway?
First of all, thank you for introducing. Can you hear me okay, Suzanne?
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you.
Good. Well, it's great to be involved in this. Thank you very much. And to hear some familiar voices on the call. Those of you who I've had the pleasure of meeting before will know what I'm going to say, but I've got a different spin, if you like, on the learning and unlearning, which is just as relevant as all the stuff David's been saying. But obviously, working in a cloud computing startup, I was approaching the issue from the completely opposite direction. I was employee number 3, and we've got about 16 or so employees now. But what I did, Suzanne, is I employed 2 very pleasant and very competent service managers back in 2018 who'd worked for huge corporate organizations. So they'd worked for organizations that were necessarily risk averse, that had numbers of governance gates, and that had a huge support team behind them. So at the interview, it was made quite clear, you need to unlearn all this. You're joining a small company where MVP is king. The speed we get our product to our market will decide whether we survive or not. You can't put in a gold-plated Rolls-Royce governance model and implement VeriSM in that way, because there just isn't time and it's just not appropriate. Now, for about the first 6 months, this worked very well. But unfortunately, what happened with these 2 people were they gradually started to fall back to their old ways of working. They started to relearn, if you like, what it means to have a corporate organization. So the governance steps and service management principles I put in place, which are the first 2 circles on the VeriSM slide you showed earlier, Suzanne, they started to move away from that and started to get more and more insistent on dotting the I's and crossing the T's and seeing the change plans, the implementation plans, the backout plans, and all the documentation. And it started to run the risk of slowing down development and actually not enabling us in a startup to do what we needed to do. So I know you said I hadn't got very long on these slides, so I'll try and minimize it. But my key message from this slide, from my perspective, is if you are working for a small dynamic startup company who needs to work in an agile way, please make sure everybody who joins your company is able to successfully unlearn the corporate world they've come from, because they need to be dynamic, flexible, and pragmatic. Otherwise, it just won't work. So that's what I want to add to that slide, Suzanne. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Stephen. And I think it's an interesting point that you make, because I think these large corporates also need to make that agility leap, if you like. So even if they, I don't think it's enough anymore that there's one rule for the startups and one rule for the corporate organizations. I think it will be the challenge of the corporate organizations, and I think David's provided some interesting examples of how that worked in some of his clients. But I think it will be their challenge to try to get that same level of ability while scaling up, which of course makes things a lot more complex. So very interesting. Thanks for that. In the interest of time, indeed, I'm going to move on to step 7, which I can also combine with step 8. The step 7 is about creating your current view management mesh, so providing the baseline view of your organization's unique mix of those 4 elements: resources, environment, management practices, and emerging technologies. And then, step 8, of course, the value in doing the management mesh, it can be interesting to see where you are right now. But the value also comes in seeing, what is your desired state. So your future view of that mix based on requirements for new or changed services, or a a vision for transformation for how the future should look like that you have for your organisation. And maybe Steve, while you're on a roll, perhaps I can ask you to say something about how Cloud Gateway applied the management mesh, because I believe you used it to perform a skills gap analysis.
Yeah, thanks, Suzanne. That's yeah, what I did a very early management mesh, as you've implied there, and obviously with a startup, the damn thing was changing on an almost daily basis. So I got to the point when I'd got an early management mesh that was good enough, and then I started to think, well, what can I do with this? And the idea of a capability matrix, because with a startup, you're constantly recruiting new people, everyone's learning, and the resource profile, the quality of the people you recruit and the skills they've got, those are really that's going to make or break your business. So what I did is I focused on the management mesh on one of those 4 elements you mentioned, which was resources. And I focused on our sales and marketing team, on our legal and commercial team, on my service management team, and on our DevOps team. And in each case, I went to a lower level of granularity, and I almost created what I called a mini mesh based on the skills those teams needed. Now, one of our CTO, he said basically to me at one stage, which is quite fair, he said, all you've done is produced a fancy rag chart. And actually it was, because I color coded it red, amber and green, dependent on whether the skills were mature, slightly lacking or non-existent. But by doing that and by leaving it in a mesh setup, I was able to present that fairly regularly to the senior management team, showing which areas we were improving and which areas we weren't. So my kind of message here is that the management mesh, as you say, it cannot be all things to all people. Every company's management mesh is different. And one concept that I found very interesting was focusing on the resourcing, producing mini meshes dependent on the areas I was focusing on, walking that round the departmental managers in that area, saying, how can I help you with a plan to green, to get all of these to green, so we in the startup can get exactly the staff with the right skills we want in place. I also try to take it to the next level of getting HR to use that for basically their staff records and recruitment, but that was a bit more of a battle, I'll be honest about that. But having said that, the management mesh is useful, it's dynamic, it changes, and I was able to use it to identify where we had gaps in skills and where we didn't.
Thanks very much.
On that point, Suzanne.
Yeah, thank you. David, would you like to add to that in terms of how you applied the management mesh?
Yeah, sure, and it's a lot. There's a lot of similarities there, actually. So we as we were getting to grips with the organisation and we were thinking about how to apply the management mesh, we did something similar to Steve, and we broke it up into its component pieces and began by calling it a health check, and that was designed to enable people to look at a service and not necessarily just focus on its problems, but that they knew about and go deeper and understand if it was resourced correctly, as a fantastic example as given by Steve. But the other thing we did is we flipped it. So we actually started with the desired state, and that was born out of the success we were getting with the proof of concept services. So by now, we'd spent some time looking for more services to go and work our magic on, so to speak. And people were now coming to us, but they were always asking the same question: how quickly can you get this service from red or amber to green? That's exactly what Steve just said. And we'd always come back with the response of, what is green? And we would look to use the management mesh to help people understand what they could achieve and to drive that green conversation, but also to highlight any shortfalls, whether that be resourcing or in the environment, that could impact on us delivering green. And that's how we started to achieve an enterprise view across all of those services that were interlinked to one another. And a real valuable change to come from this is that we started to demonstrate that service levels weren't necessarily everything they appear to be, which was often green. And I'm sure everyone's heard the term watermelon SLAs, but we were seeing service levels that actually weren't relevant to the consumer of the service. So, availability, for example, services could be available for the whole month, but unavailable on the last Friday of the month for an hour, and suddenly people's paydays in jeopardy, for example. And we started to redesign how we measured services and started to implement XLAs or enterprise level agreements. The other thing we did is we introduced the management mesh as a concept into the defined stage of new services. So now people could speak with the business about what they wanted to achieve before they actually started rolling the service out. And this really focused the conversation on value. And I think that's one of the things that had a real big impact for that particular business.
Thanks, David. I think it's really interesting, that kind of switch from SLA to XLA, you know, really starting to measure the experience as opposed to just trying to get greens on, you know, availability and incident management and all of that. So yeah, really interesting. I'm a bit conscious of time and I want to have some time for questions as well. Step 9 is close gaps and manage to the VeriSM stages. So obviously once that gap between current and desired state is clear, you can take steps to close it and continually improve as your business evolves. Perhaps quickly, David, we can run through this one of any practical examples on how to close this gap.
Yeah, sure. So I'll do my best to keep this brief but informative. So when it came to defining the quality and value in the services, we used an outside-in approach by always focusing on the customer and understanding what outcomes and values that they would need to achieve for a service, but also any regulatory compliance. When it came to what we could do to improve the service, we then went to inside out. So of that which we are responsible for, how can we meet the defined value and outcome of that service? And that could involve focusing on all the pieces that hung off a service, such as suppliers or commercials or the management practices. And if I just go forward a slide, I'll give you a practical example of something we used. So what we did is, once we'd actually built the management mesh per service, we realized that people couldn't spend all of their time looking at every single aspect of their service. But what we asked them to do was to focus in on an element of that service. And this document here is essentially an infographic that we use just to help people understand what they needed to focus on. And we termed it quality of service, and we asked them to look for areas for improved performance, availability, reliability, and efficiency. And we highlighted areas that they could focus on, and this wasn't telling them what to focus on, it was just giving them an idea of where they could go, and also with the education we'd given them with the management mesh. But we looked at things such as reliability, risk, understanding third-party vendors and their interactions, the maintainability of that service. A number of services were nearing end of life, and that's really important to understand what's going to happen there. The integrity of their data, knowledge was massive. Looking at their service roadmap, which sits well with maintainability, processes, which I've mentioned earlier, architecture, and obviously people. What we came out with was always outputs and output focused. So it was agreed that recommendations would be lifted to C-level. That they would take action to improve services incrementally, because you can't necessarily just wave a magic wand and do everything, and that magic wand might be budget, for example. We would roll up recommendations by region, but also by depending services. And we had now had an entry point into what had become the Global Right Practice process group, or the Global Right Practice for Service Quality. And this level of focus on a weekly basis just gave people enough time to start thinking about quality rather than just thinking about keeping the lights on.
Thanks very much, David, for that. Okay, in terms of then the final step is about basically getting the knowledge you need. Again, you always have to ask the why question with this, in the same way as why, what do I want to achieve with a digital transformation? Why, what do I want to achieve with VeriSM? The same thing is, of course, with training and certification. But obviously, if you're wanting to use VeriSM to help support digital transformation, you need to have the right knowledge and skills. And here's just a few of the sessions that have been going on around the world. The top one is the ECB session with the ECB in Germany. On the left-hand side was a group of Dell employees in India. And on the right-hand side was a group of Sogeti consultants and employees here in the Netherlands. Obviously, you can find more information on the training and certification via the Exin site. But maybe I'd just like to briefly ask you, David, to say what it brought you, the training and certification.
Well, how long have we got? I'll keep it brief. So my engagement was a fun one because I was between assignments, and I found VeriSM, and I thought, oh, this looks good. This will be a good one to get on the CV. So I sat and I took the VeriSM Foundation exam and failed, and that piqued my interest actually, because I thought, well, I've worked in this industry for many years and I'm ITIL qualified. What makes it so different? So I ended up buying the books. And then the case study that I've taken you through, which is actually a couple of organisations, but I've pulled it into one. I was sat down with a C-level person on my second day in, I believe, and he said, "Have you heard of VeriSM?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, it's something we're interested in, and you know, can you tell me more?" And I'm sat there thinking, "Oh, I need to go and pass that qualification now." So that's how I became engaged with VeriSM, and frankly, I've found it so useful in terms of the way I think and the way I apply my service management beliefs, but also in how I help organizations apply what they've already invested in, you know, in terms of DevOps and Agile and Lean. Yeah. Because
I think I really have to stop you there, David.
This is what we're looking to
do
here
sorry, if I'd like to maybe just try to take a couple of questions, but what we'll do is we'll take all of the questions that we've received and we'll answer them in a document as well. So any questions that we don't have time to do today, don't worry, we'll provide some answers on them later. One of the questions, David, was how did you initially engage the organisation? That's one of the questions that came through. Could you say something about that?
So in one case, they were looking for something different. They felt like their investment in training and technology had been failing, and that's where the "Have you heard of VeriSM?" question came up. And in another case, I took the management mesh. I was in a conversation with a potential client who were facing a digital transformation and similar issues, and I drew them a management mesh of where they wanted to go. And they told me that was the moment when they realized that they wanted me to go in there. And they're the two big scenarios that I've had to use to actually generate interest and engagement through stakeholders.
Wonderful, thank you. And maybe a quick question for you as well, Steve, that's come through is if you made use of competence frameworks like Sophia or the ECF, that kind of thing, in what you were doing with the application at Cloud Gateway, the skills analysis.
Yeah, the answer, Suzanne, is kind of yes and no, because I've done some Sophia work before in one of my previous jobs, but the thing about having a small organization with initially only a few people, you can focus directly on their needs and their skills. And it was, in turning that to the management mesh, it was more about matching the skills we had and we felt we needed to how our business would grow, rather than working against the definitions of a framework. That's not that there's anything wrong with that. That's the way we did it initially. Okay.
Yeah. Thanks for that. We also, you know, the Exin certifications are mapped to the ECF framework, so they can be very powerful tools. But yeah, I can understand it's not always the starting point. I think we have time for one last question, and I'd like to ask you to take this one, David, as well. It's clear that VeriSM is a useful approach for digital transformation. Is it therefore mainly aimed at strategic people within an organisation?
And I would say that the simple answer is no. The VeriSM is useful to everybody in the organisation, not least of all the consumers and customers within the organisation. I think you said at the beginning, Suzanne, that this is about making IT a key part of the business rather than a service provider within the business. And yeah, VeriSM, when I've used it with customers of my customers, has been really well received. And yeah, I would certainly say it's useful for all.
Thanks very much. Okay, well, I'd like to thank all of you for attending. I don't want to keep you longer than the hour. I'd like to thank specifically David for co-presenting today, but also Steve and Claire for their guest appearances, and everybody for attending. We will send you some information with the materials which were promised for the 10 steps, as well as a link to the recording of this webinar. So thank you very much, and I'll also send the answers to the questions which we didn't get time to handle today. So thank you everybody, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.